بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. I was asked to give a little lecture today on an overview and a brief understanding about Islamic banking and finance. And so today's talk is going to be just an overview about what this industry is, what it can provide us, and just showing you the reality that it is a viable solution. And the Western world is coming to recognize this as well. And before I begin, one thing I did want to say is that we as a community, from the get-go of being brought up in the Western world and Western standpoint, even in the Muslim lands, one of the biggest tragedies and travesties that has happened is that our endowed institutions, so independent institutions, educational institutions that used to be funded independently, when colonization took place, that was destroyed. So at one point, Al-Azhar was an independent, endowed institution, just like how you have endowments here. I mean, Harvard has a $30 billion endowment. And what that did was that it created a level of independence from the organization to make their own decisions and not being influenced by the governments. When the colonizers came and colonization took place, one of the first things they did was destroy waqf, or endowments for many things. And one of the biggest hits was to educational institutions. So when we talk about, I hope you guys don't mind, but I feel too, I like standing up and talking, so I'm just going to stand up. But one of the things that happened was that the educational institutions were affected, where their independence of what they would present was taken away. And Al-Azhar and many other institutions suffered from this. And this is why this concept of Islamic finance seems to be so new to us. But actually it isn't. If you look at the history of Muslim contribution, you'll see that from an economic standpoint, almost 600 years before the current day, Ibn Khaldun actually had propositions of how governments should deal with recessions. 600 years before even the Americans or the British had created that. In fact, Al-Makhrizi, he created and discussed the concept of how counterfeit currency affects the economy, which was 300 years before, even in the Western world, they're discussing the issue of counterfeit and fake currencies and so on and so forth. The letter of credit that businesses use today, that concept was created by Muslims 1,000 years ago. And the Medicis of Italy, they adopted the concept of the letter of credit, which is being able to, it functions similar somewhat to a concept of a check, right? And what the Medicis did was that they took this concept and added interest into it, and then they made it into more of a Western structure. So the Muslims were very educated when it comes to finance. And that's one thing that we as Muslims need to realize, that our history was not just founded from a mercantile system of just the past 200 years, but rather when you look at the Quran, the system in the Quran is a mercantile system based on buying goods, selling, commerce, and so on and so forth. So if I know that we don't have slides set up, but one of the interesting things that one of my professors actually presented to us was in 1916 at Columbia University. There was a PhD student who had actually done his research on Muhammadan finance. So that was his PhD dissertation, Muhammadan finance. So Islamic finance, finance according to Prophet Muhammad, which is what they used to call Muslims, Muhammadan. So this was actually considered in much detail in that time frame and was discussed on an academic level. Now, coming to modern times about Islamic finance, is that the industry is vast. Currently, we're sitting at over $2 trillion. Recently, the DIFC, Dubai Islamic Finance Center, actually stated that the realized potential of Islamic banking finance is almost $6 trillion. So if we actually realize it and put it up to its fullest potential, we're sitting at a system worth over 6 trillion. There was an article the other day that I read that Muslim money right now that hasn't been injected into the Islamic financial system is sitting at almost $10 trillion. So we have a huge contribution, and we have a huge system that is that we can actually utilize to the benefit of society. So just quick items was that in the past maybe 10 years, prior to this oil dip, per annum, Islamic banking finance was growing between 15 to 26% depending on certain areas. So it was the fastest growing financial sector in the financial industry, and it currently is beating out in speed in reference of growth, the conventional finance. And as you all know, in 2009, while the governments bailed out financial institutions in the tune of 1.4 trillion, at that point, Islamic banks were still growing in excess of 12%. And none of the banks there, Islamic financial institutions, got actually any bailouts from governments. So we can see that the system is a robust system because it's based on the reality of the real economy and not fictitious economy where you just create value out of paper and then you assign value to it, but there's nothing actually there. It's just a piece of paper and that's it. So one of the things that differs Islamic banking and finance is the ethical criteria, right? So when you look at conventional financing and Islamic financing, one of the first diametric difference you'll see is the criteria of how and what they will finance. So from an Islamic perspective, of course, money is not the only objective, but rather societal benefit from a monetary benefit is what is permitted. So what I mean is, for example, you will never see, and it is not permitted for Islamic banking or financial institutions to invest or provide financing to armament companies, people that create bombs, create these airplanes to kill people, civilians, ammunition, so on. It is not permitted. So because of the societal consequence that takes place. Further, you will not see them invest or provide financing to tobacco institutions or companies, anything to deal with, of course, with alcohol, with gambling, with pornography, with many other things, even certain pharmaceutical companies, the way they function. There is even a standpoint there from, are they actually functioning in an ethical standpoint or not? So we have an ethical component, which is very important. And in the modern day and age, when you see that, what is the first thing that you see from bankers and so on and so forth with the financial institution is that there is no ethics. There is no standard. Anything is allowed. They will do anything from a financial perspective, which is why we saw the subprime mortgage, right? The subprime mortgage was a setup that the least, the society that had the least capacity to pay back debt were charged the highest interest, right? In some places in the tune of excess of 18%. So what does that do? It sets up a system of failure, which would never be permitted from a cannibalization standpoint of Islamic banking finance and taking advantage of people. So that is an important aspect that differs from the conventional standpoint. Of course, the hallmarks of Islamic banking and finance is that you cannot have a system, or within the contracts, you cannot have anything with interest, which is understood. But in that, you cannot also have anything to do with speculation, right? So a lot of the issues with financial institutions now is the speculative positions that they are taking, and which creates a risk upon all of society, which is why we had governments to bail out these banks. And to give you one example, there are financial instruments called derivatives. And one of the instruments that financial institutions like Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, etc., that they use is the CDO, which is the credit default swap. And what that means is that me as a bank, I make a bet to another bank that my client will not be able to pay my loan. And the other bank will make a bet that your client will be able to pay your loan. And then we basically put on a wager and see what is the value? If I win, this is what I'll get. If you win, this is what you'll get. So you are actually making a bet against your own clients and saying that will they fail and this is the reward that they will get, which is not based on any actual real economy activity. It's just a wager. So when you have instruments like this which are being utilized, obviously it creates a level of extreme risk and it creates a level of extreme exposure because it's not backed by anything. It's just a game. It's just a betting game. And these were one of the instruments that created and played a big role in the financial meltdown that took place in 2009. So that's one item, which is speculation, as well as ambiguity, which is gharar. So from an Islamic financial perspective, there cannot be a level of ambiguity in the contractual formulation. And that even the contract itself, and we look at it, right? Look at the last time you signed a visa contract, right? I mean, you look at the fine print and you have like 18 pages of fine print, right? When is the last time a person actually went through all that? And when they do, they realize that it's just convoluted. There's so much information that you don't know what to do with it. One of the things from an Islamic financial perspective is that even from a contract, it cannot be made so over difficult that the person themselves cannot understand what they're getting themselves into. Which again shows a level of fairness and equity, that there has to be a level playing field. Yes, of course, I mean, there is legal jargon that a layman doesn't understand, which you get your lawyer as your advisor to help with. But the contract and the formulation should be in a level that it is not taking advantage of people's ignorance of the matter. And that it's not taking advantage of even the council's ignorance. So again, this is one other aspect that Islamic banking and finance takes into place. And you can see these three items play a big role in creating a level of fairness, in creating a level of equity between participants who take place and who are involved in this industry. Now, one of the things that we see is that people ask, well, you know, if there's no interest, how is money made, and so on and so forth, etc., etc. See, one of the things that the Vatican actually pointed out was that in 2009, the Vatican issued that the conventional financial institutions should take their advice, or they should look at how Islamic banking and finance actually run, because they actually have a strong relationship with their clients, and not only that, they actually create real economic activity. So the Vatican actually issued a statement about Islamic banking and finance. One of the main things was in reference of profit and loss sharing, which is in commercial finance. So what that means is that when you as a person, for example, is going to a bank and saying, I want to start my business, what an Islamic financial institution would the setup would be, and this is only one of many contracts. So one thing as well, we have to realize that there is not a monolith of what Islamic finance is, it's a mosaic. There is many different contracts that you can use independently and in conjunction. So you cannot just pigeonhole one product as that's Islamic banking and finance and that's it. It's not. It's a vast area and has a plethora of different products. So one of the products would be profit and loss sharing, which is a partnership. So you would go to the bank and say, I want to start up, a lumber business. And the bank would then provide you financing, the fact that you guys would create a business of joint venture. So the money the bank would actually give is not a loan to you anymore, is an equity injection into your business. And what does that do? What that means is that when you're actually making a profit, the bank shares in your profit. And when you make a loss, the bank is proportionally sharing in the loss. Now, when you look at conventional standpoint, that is not how financing works at all. How does it work? Regardless of how your business goes, you have to pay me a fixed return on the money I've lent you, irrespective of if your business is doing well or not. And if it's not, we'll just foreclose on you if you cannot make those payments. So even from an investment or from a funding standpoint, you can see the difference of how this system works. And the reason why this is important is that when financial institutions actually have their neck on the line as well, they'll be more fair and just in reference of how they fund projects, but also they will take an added interest to make sure that the project is done successfully because they share then in the success of that business. Now, if a bank, all they do is that, fine, here's the money, and give me 7%, 8% return on interest every year, they don't care how you function. They don't care if your business goes down or not, because they have security against your business, and you're paying them a fixed return. So this then does not allow a level of collaboration which creates the success of a business. So they're not holding hand in hand, but they're actually 100% separate. So this profit and loss perspective is a very, very, very important aspect of Islamic banking and finance. And what this does is that it makes an investment in real economy. And when I say real economy, I mean investing in tangible reality, right? Not just investing on a paper and saying that this paper is now worth $1 trillion and that's it. There is no physical asset backing it. And that's a big difference between conventional and Islamic finance. That you have the money that is issued is actually backed by physical assets. That there is value derived, that there's something behind it deriving the value, right? So now when you look at our current economy, fiat currency, the paper money that we have, where is its value derived? Its value is just derived because the government says this is $5. That's it. Back in the days, that $5 was actually backed by gold. So that you could only create value when you had an asset to create value from. When you create value without anything backing this asset, then you create a system where there's over leverage everywhere. And that's where the current economy and so on and so forth sits. And that's another important reality of the Islamic economic system, of having physical, tangible asset backing, which is super important because then it doesn't create a speculation system. Also, another item is the reality of charity funds. So, one of the items that you will see from an Islamic banking and financial institution is that if you actually look at Kuwait finance houses, financial statements, or these other institutions, you will actually see that they actually have funds set up of giving zero interest loans to people. So they have funds set up to assist people who are wanting to get married, who can't get married. They actually give them 0% interest. People who have cancer, who need treatment, who cannot afford it, they provide them loans. There's a charity fund within these institutions that they help society with. Right? Obviously, it's not everything, but there is amount that they implement. And if you look, that's a stark difference of what we see about corporate social responsibility. CSR in modern times, when I see it, is just a public relation department trying to show the world, oh look what we're doing, but you're really not doing much. It's just trying to say that, oh look how many people we've helped and how many things we've done. But it's just more about public relation. These institutions actually have it within their actual budgeting of how they help society. Another example is that in Malaysia, from some of these funds, they've actually created orphanages and all across. So what they do is that if you, for example, have financing from an Islamic bank, and they have a penalty that if you do not actually make payments, that they will charge you a penalty. Otherwise, people would be taking advantage of the Islamic banks because they say, well, they won't do anything, whatever. So what they would do is that penalty that they would charge you, they do not actually profit from it. They put it into a charity fund. And then after a certain time, that charity fund reaches a certain point, and then they invest that money into charities. So even from the penalty amounts, they're not even profiting from it, but actually using that money and putting it back to society. And see, this is the very big difference of when you look at the Islamic system, that you can be profitable, but you actually give a damn about society. You're not taking advantage of it and being rapacious in every capacity. And that is a blessing of our faith, that our faith actually allows that and implements that and tells you to do that. In Islam, there is no issue of being profitable. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, and when you look at an Islamic financial contract, to make one of the stipulations is offer an acceptance, right? Ijab and qabul. I can tell you that I'm going to sell you this cell phone for $1 million. And if you're sane, baligh, in a proper mental capacity and many other criterias, you can do that and you can sell this phone for $1 million, provided that you accept it. So there is no issue of saying that, oh, well, how can you be rich in Islam and how can you be profitable or not, or whatever the case may be. That's irrespective of our faith. Our faith allows it. We're not a faith of asceticism where we say just, be the poorest person on earth. Because we know that's not the case. And if that was the case, the Prophet ﷺ himself was a merchant. His wife, Hazrat Khadija, was a merchant. Hazrat Abdurrahman ibn Auf, one of the most wealthiest man. He was a merchant. All these people, in fact, of the Ashara Mubashara, the 10 granted paradise on this earth, it was only Hazrat Ali who wasn't a merchant. Everyone else was a businessman. Right? So there was a level of commerce always present in Islam. So that being said now, coming to the reality of Canada, just to let you guys know that Islamic finance is not a reality that the Canadian government or our financial or the financial institutions haven't understood. Just this past December, the Canadian government sent a special envoy to the largest Islamic banking conference in the world in Manama, Bahrain, which is called the WIBC, the World Islamic Banking Conference. They met with Dubai and the Dubai Chamber of Commerce and dealing with the DIFC in how Dubai can assist Canada in bringing regulatory requirements to allow Islamic finance to prosper in Canada. You have KPMG, who has created a white paper on how the taxation system of Canada can actually, how to harmonize Islamic financial contracts in the taxation system of Canada. So we do have actually a lot of work taking place, but unfortunately the reality is that in the western part of Canada we seem to be very ignorant of what's happening. And the governments have realized that when you have a 2 trillion plus industry, that it just makes sense that you want to take part in it, that you want to profit from the profitability, right? And one of the things that the TFSA, which is the Toronto Financial Services Alliance, is doing is that it is trying to set up Toronto as the Islamic finance hub of North America. Because they've realized that Islamic finance is real, it is a burgeoning industry, and the only way to create a competitive edge over New York or over Chicago or San Francisco is Islamic finance for Toronto. That's the only competitive advantage it can have over those cities. And that is the reason why that they are really pushing forward for this. In England, the British government issued an Islamic bond, which is called the Sukuk, right? In London is actually the Western hub of Islamic banking and finance. They actually have 18 Islamic financial institutions in England. And one of them, the Islamic Bank of Britain, is actually backed by the government as well, that they have support. So there is a lot taking place in the world. Another example is Belgium. Belgium right now is actually working on how to bring Islamic banking and finance into Belgium. And many of you may or may not know, but the largest halal certification organization in the world essentially, especially in Europe and the Western world, is actually in Belgium. And that is where they actually certify halal zabiha items. And places like the UAE, actually in fact all the Gulf areas, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, they recognize this authority as a leading authority and accept when they stamp it as halal that it is zabiha and halal. Now what Belgium has realized is that they are the place and they are the headquarter of this halal certification industry. Why not also become an important center of halal financing? Because it makes sense. There's halal from a food standpoint, why not from a finance standpoint? And they did actually a survey of almost 500 people, and they came to a conclusion that it makes sense for Islamic banking finance to exist there. Same with Germany, same with Switzerland and Luxembourg. All over the world, it's taking place and it's coming by storm. There was an important report by E&Y, Ernst & Young, that they were discussing about the growth of the developing nation to the Western world. And in 1985, if I remember the numbers correctly, 13% of the global GDP, of the entire global GDP, only the developed world contributed to. The rest of it was from the industrialized world. Now we sit 30 years later, and the developing world now contributes 41% of the global GDP in just 30 years. And now we're seeing, where is the growth coming from? It's coming from the developing world. Where is this disposable income coming from? It's coming from the developing world. If you look at London, for example, they were showing that the top 10 countries that invested in England were actually from the developing world. Malaysia was one of them, Singapore was the other, and a few other countries. Same with the US. In the top 10 for FDI that they have, Malaysia is in that, the top 10. Of course, we know Saudi is as well. So when you have the Muslim world that is now increasing from their monetary standpoint, and they have now more disposable income, where is that money going? It's obviously going to go towards investment. And if we're seeing that 1.6 billion people of that developing world are Muslims, it just makes logical sense that the growth is going to be in Islamic finance. It just makes sense. Now, in the Muslim countries, we have issues in reference of the growth of Islamic finance because the society has not been educated what Islamic finance is. When was the last time you or yourself actually sat down and really tried to understand what Islamic in banking and finance is all about? When was the last time? When was the last time that you thought about, can a financial product really exist without interest? When was the last time you thought about that? Right? It's taking the knowledge that we have and turning it on its head. That's what it's doing. And because we were never privy to this knowledge due to the colonization, which broke us from our past glorious history of positive contributions we made, now we are actually trying to pick up the pieces and coming to that realization, oh no, we actually did contribute substantially, and we did have a financial system that made sense and worked. And which is why in Muslim countries there's skepticism, because right away people say, well, how can something exist without interest? That's our responsibility now as Muslims, that not only does the system, is it growing from a liquidity standpoint, but as society in general, we ourselves need to educate ourselves about what the system is. I find it actually, when I see universities like UofA and other universities, especially from the business school standpoint, that are trying to position themselves as one of the most regarded business schools in the top 100 in the world, I find it to be very short-sighted that they have no coursework or even a course on this industry. If you look at Cambridge and Oxford, they have a faculty of Islamic finance. When you're talking about the best institutions, educational institutions in the world, the London Business School and LSE, and you'll see many other the leading education institutions of the world, they actually have these departments. For a business school and the finance department to actually stay relevant and stay cutting edge, this is where, as students like yourself, that you have to vie to the institutions, to the educational institutions, to the deans of the business school or of the university, and say that we need this education. We need a curriculum that imposes and provides an alternative understanding of finance, which is Islamic banking and finance. There's actually an instructor who I helped with her thesis, and actually in NATE, she's a non-Muslim sister. And her thesis was on how Islamic finance helps with economic development. And she's out of, I believe, Newfoundland, and she teaches now in NATE. And it was interesting how she was discussing with me that I'm surprised that there is nothing taught about this industry when the rest of the world knows what's happening, right? From an education standpoint, it seems so important. She goes, in the textbook that I teach is only one sentence about Islamic banking and finance, and that's it, out of a 400-page textbook. So it's important that we make society in our educational institutions aware that this is a reality that they should be teaching, because this is the future. It really is. Conventional finance is going to be there, but Islamic finance will be growing and taking the share of conventional finance. And there's no doubt about that. Further, just before I conclude, we don't have slides, but I wanted to actually show some news images and news clippings, and I'll just read them out to you. So, for example, you have in Hong Kong, the Morning Star of Hong Kong, that they have an article that Hong Kong must attract Islamic finance to remain a global market. So this is what's coming out from Hong Kong. Another article was London and Dubai want the Islamic finance crown. Those two are jostling to try to make themselves the Islamic finance crown, especially in that Western hub. Right now, the crown actually goes to Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. It is the leading hub for Islamic banking and finance. And subhanAllah, you'll see the difference when you have a government that wants to foster the growth of something as opposed to the government that doesn't. And a quick example is Mid-Ghamar Bank in Egypt. In 1963, they tried to set up an Islamic bank in Mid-Ghamar, and the government did not aid it. In fact, it contributed to its failure, which is why it never actually succeeded and flourished in Egypt. Now you look at the total difference what took place in Malaysia. In Malaysia, they have an organization called Tabung Haji. Tabung Haji is basically a fund where every month, you know how we put our CPP monthly or whatever the case may be. In Malaysia, they have a setup that every month you take a certain portion of your money and you put it into the Hajj fund, so that by the time you're 40 or 45 years old, you have money saved up to actually go for Hajj, right? I mean, what a beautiful, beautiful thinking by that government, right? This is what you call long-term thinking. And what Tabung Haji then did was that it created with that money, because obviously when you're investing now at 25, you're not going to need it until you're 40. So there's obviously 15, 20 years of that money not being utilized. They created toll roads. They would create infrastructure, and then they would charge tolls so that they would then get a return on their money, because now they're actually charging money on a physical asset that they created. And this was one of the reasons, this was the inception of Islamic banking and finance growing actually in Malaysia. And it continues to be the leading hub in every capacity. Before I conclude, one of the things that is really important that we understand is that there are a lot of investments that have taken place whose accolades go to this industry. So for example, the Shard, which is the tallest building in London and in fact Europe, this project was actually going belly up until an Islamic equity consortium out of Qatar gave money to actually build this building. And now today, the tallest building in Europe exists because of Islamic banking and finance. And it is a symbol of Islamic banking and finance. Many of us, obviously like James Bond and so on and so forth, Aston Martin, it was actually partially financed and funded through an Islamic bond from Kuwait. So 50% of the company was actually owned through an Islamic financial institution. And we have many, many examples right now taking place where Islamic banking and finance is playing a huge, huge role. So in conclusion, my main point to you guys is that feel proud of our history. There is a lot that this system can provide, and believe you and me, within the next 5 years, you will see a huge boom in this industry in Canada, because Canada is recognizing its importance, and the world right now is recognizing its importance. Even with the current oil issues that are taking place, the economy, that industry is still growing. It may not be, albeit to the huge proportions that they are, but it is still resilient and growing. And right now, to get liquidity and capital, people are going to the Islamic financial industry everywhere. And you will see, for example, countries like Ireland, who have set themselves up, their stock exchange to be Sharia compliant, so that they can actually get Islamic bonds and so on and so forth listed on their stock exchange, because the only way that they would differentiate themselves with London would be that, even though London does do that now, but they want a portion of it, they want a piece of it. And if everyone is wanting a piece of it, then it just makes sense that our country comes on board. The United States, unfortunately, won't come on board for a long time because of the Islamophobia that's present there. And to make these regulations take place, it won't happen. And we can just clearly see the racism that's present from the Republican debates and how they talk about Muslims. So this is to our advantage in this country. And with the new Trudeau government in place, which is obviously less racist towards Muslims as the conservatives that led, that there will be a strong push towards this. And this article that I was talking about the Canadian envoy going in, was in the Globe and Mail just in December, I believe it was December 24th or December 23rd, 2015. So there's a lot of activity taking place. So with that, inshallah, I will conclude and open it up for questions and let Rabiel take over. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I see.
So, well, just a couple of questions. Most people here understand the value of a credit rating, and there aren't too many ways to avoid interest while being able to build your credit rating. I myself have a Visa and a MasterCard, both with a cashback option on purchases I spend. Is there any support in Islamic banking for credit ratings and credit cards and stuff like that? Because increasingly these days, you can't even find a place to park without a credit card.
Absolutely.
And second, I do not represent Christianity, but there's a Christian teaching that says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Just wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, your point in reference of credit is definitely, I mean, it's a reality. It's not something that we can ignore. And see, the thing with the Sharia is that there is when you look at the maqasid of Sharia, and when you actually look at Islamic legal maxims or usul al-fiqh, you'll see that it takes into consideration the situation of the society that you're in, right? So, I mean, in Dubai, for example, and in Malaysia, they do have actual credit cards which do not function like the MasterCard or Visa cards that do function in the Western world. They have a system, and I mean, the product is quite complex, so I don't want to just get into detail of it because it'll take a long time to discuss it. But it does exist, and a lot of countries are coming on board of having an Islamic credit card and what that entails. So, I mean, of course, that is not a reality that can be avoided, but obviously, when you're creating a new industry, you have to start from someplace. So you have to start with what you have, right? And just for the people, like, for example, a lot of people expect something to go from 0 to Islamic, 100% Islamic overnight, which is not possible. It's absolutely not possible, which is why Mufti Taqi Usmani and many other scholars have talked about this, that to expect something to go 0 to 100% Sharia compliant in this industry, it is foolish to consider that. And the backing of that as well is when you look at the legal injunctions of alcohol in Islam, it did not start from you cannot drink alcohol at all, right? It came in 3 different stages, right? So the scholastic traditions looks at how the rulings apply to society. In reference of the kingdom of heaven and whatever, I mean, in Christianity actually, there are many places where Jesus actually states to not be charging your fellow Christians interest. I don't have the actual quotes memorized, but I was looking over it actually today. And St. Thomas Aquinas himself, he said that it is unchristian to charge a Christian brother interest. And there's many, many places, even in Judaism, it is not permitted to charge amongst Jewish people interest. So this is not a component which only is relegated to Islam, but it's onto all 3 Abrahamic religions. Where Islam exceeds in that is that Islam doesn't say that you cannot charge interest to just Muslims. It says you cannot charge interest to anyone. Giving and taking of interest is forbidden, right? It is forbidden. It doesn't matter if someone is an atheist or is a Muslim. right? So it does not have any I in reference of faith and how to deal with it. I mean, coming to the point of the wealthy going to heaven and not, I mean that's not a topic that I can make my decision. I mean, that's in the hands of God. He decides who goes and who doesn't. So I mean, I'll just leave that question out for now.
Any other questions or thoughts?
Can you speak about mortgage, please?
Mortgage in what capacity?
In how is it okay for Muslims to go in and get a house with mortgage?
I mean, I'm not a scholar, so I can't make a scholarly statement and stuff like that at all, and I'm not professing to be doing that. However, studying and seeing scholars coming to their positions, some scholars permitting it, and other scholars, which is probably the vast majority, not permitting it, I see the benefit in the assessment of why they came to those decisions. Some scholars do say that in the Western world, specific Canada and in the US, where Islamic financial options are so infant that there is no other way to go, that some have permitted that your primary residence, you can get a mortgage. However, many scholars, the majority of them say that what is the use of a house? The house is main usage is protecting you from the elements, which is the exterior, right? From rain, from wind, whatever. It's providing you a place where you live, not actually a statement of being a net worth, not being an item on your net worth. So I remember Imam Zaid Shakir was talking about the struggles of people. He said in the third world, the struggle is trying to find clean water. In the first world, for the Muslims, the struggle is, do I rent? Right? And this is where there is obviously a dichotomy and there's a differences of opinion. And I mean, I am not here to tell you if you can or cannot do, but there are differences of opinions of that. The best is if you can avoid it, then you do it. I mean, that's the best. But I mean, we do take into consideration there are issues that come up. Like one example is that and the reason why I want to bring this up is that I remember when I used to be younger and young guns like a lot of you guys here in university, you know, you have this very utopian understanding of what Sharia and Islam is, and it's not. It is not a black and white faith. Our religion is the most pragmatic religion. It is absolutely the most pragmatic religion. The gray areas are there because it is there for interpretation. And one example is this, that when the Spanish Inquisition was taking place, the ulama of the Muslim world permitted the Moriscos, who were the Muslims, who were being forced to convert to Christianity, that they could eat pork and drink alcohol. Because had they had not done that, that they would be killed and they would be crucified or they would be put in the guillotine. So that ruling was only permitted and permissible for Al-Andalus. So even when you look at fiqh rulings, it is only, you have to see, the scholar that is giving the ruling first has to see how the society is, and many rulings are only permitted to a certain society. I remember once I was sitting with, in a majlis where Mufti Taqi Usmani was present, and people talked about sighting of the moon issues. He said, listen brothers, and this was in Vancouver, I'm not from Vancouver, I'm from Pakistan. Deal with your scholars on these issues which are pertinent to you, because I don't live here. So I don't take my ruling on issues in Canada. I don't live in Canada. I live in Karachi, Pakistan, right? So there is a beautiful reality in our Sharia that looks into all of these things. So everything isn't black and white. There is a level of circumstance and so on and so forth.
Who's the Mufti in Edmonton that we can speak to about these big issues in Islamic financing?
I mean, about mortgages and so on and so forth. I mean, you could talk to any of the scholars in the masjids that you want. The thing is, I mean, if you're gonna sit down and discuss, a derivative product or this and that. I don't know if they'll be able to tell you about those type of things. But if you're wanting to know about permitted items and is it permitted to get a mortgage or not and this and that, et cetera, then I mean you can talk to any scholar and see where they stand on that position.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this already, because I'm a little late. But are there any, I guess, texts in the English language that you recommend as starter text on the topic?
Absolutely. Actually, there's a free PDF by Mufti Taqi Usmani, which is on, I believe it's called The Introduction to Islamic Finance. So that's a good starting point to start from. You can Google it, you'll find it. He's giving it fi sabilillah free.
Do you know if there are any financial instruments available to the common person to invest in to get exposure to Sharia compliant investments like mutual funds or the ETFs?
Say that again, sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Mutual funds or ETFs that are Sharia compliant? Do you know of any that people can invest in?
Well, there's, I mean, I don't know in North America if they are. Of course, in Muslim countries, they do have it, like Dubai and in Malaysia and Indonesia. But you do have like the Dow Jones Islamic indexes, which you can invest in, which have been approved by scholars. And I mean, and that's what some people do invest in. I think from ETFs and mutual funds, I don't know right now if there is a Sharia compliant offering here in Canada or North America. I mean, I haven't come across it. There could be, I'm not sure.
For student loans, is there, most of us probably have student loans, but is there kind of a way around it, or is there like a halal, Sharia compliant way with student loans? Is there like any organizations that help out here?
I mean, structuring of a student loan, of course, there are Sharia compliant options. The problem is it's in the Muslim countries, not here, right? I mean, there is an organization called IANA Financial here in Edmonton. They do help provide Sharia compliant, basically zero interest loans for people to pay back, and I think they've issued probably 40 or 50. And it's basically a fund that the community of Edmonton and others, you know, they'll put money in fi sabilillah and help students, you know, fund their education. I mean, I don't think they fund like the full 40,000 tuition, but they will provide some funding to assist people.
So, just with regards to the Islamic banks kind of in the Western world, is there any regulatory body that's kind of overseeing them, or is there, you know, anything where they're kind of being audited or processed to make sure, one, that they are Islamic, and secondly, that there is no other, for lack of a better word, fraudulent behavior or anything like that?
No, you're right, and that's a really, really good question, because there has been fraudulent stuff, as in any case, right? It doesn't matter if it's something that's religious or not. You will always find fraudsters taking advantage of people, right? Simple as that. I mean, I was reading about some guy who set up a cancer fund. He didn't have cancer, and out of sympathy, people were giving him money, right? I mean, you have people who will do ridiculous things, and Islamic finance is not safe from that either. But they do have a Sharia board. Usually Islamic banks will have 3 to 5 scholars who are on the board, who then assess the compliance of the bank and financial institutions. For example, KPMG, Deloitte, PwC, and E&Y in places like the GCC, in the places in Southeast Asia, even Pakistan, in some of these areas, they actually have Sharia auditing, where they actually audit the banks from a Sharia compliance perspective, are they or not. So that does take place, and these banks do get audited from a Sharia compliance standpoint. Yeah.
Is there any federal audit or anything like that going on, say, like in Europe or anything like that, from the country's Ministry of Finance or whatnot?
You know, for that, I don't know, but I'm sure that they have people that probably are, because I mean, I mean, even conventional banks are always looked at, so I'm sure that even from an Islamic financial institution standpoint, of course, there will be people, regulators and gatekeepers in place to make sure that issues aren't coming up, or fraudulent activities aren't taking place, or innocent people aren't being taken advantage of under the guise of Islamic finance.
Okay, so how does a 0% interest financial institution like actually work? So I know you talked about Malaysia, and when people would have late payments, I think the banks would take that money and they would put it to like an orphanage or something, right? But then at the end of the day, are we still paying interest on that money, except they're just using it for good? So how does it exactly work? Like,
So that is just for a penalty, and for example, your own interest payments, the interest that you make from money that you have in banks and stuff, that money that you get, you can put it into anything. For example, you can actually donate it to the masjid to create bathrooms with, right? You are permitted to use it outside and create roads with. So illicit money like that is still permitted to be used. The reason why they do that, and the scholars have permitted it, is that if there is no binding factor to make people stay true to their payment schedule, then everyone will take advantage of them. Oh, forget it, I don't care, I'm not paying, right? So you need to have accountability and measures in place to make people accountable. In reference of, it's not just about zero, it's not, the idea isn't about zero interest. How banks make their money, Islamic financial institutions, they make it from many aspects. One is through agency, acting as an agent for a client. Other is profit sharing. Other is owning assets and selling it to clients, right? So for example, a brief example I'll just give you guys is that for mortgages, one of the contracts that is used is called murabaha. And what the bank does is that you as a client come and say, I want to buy a house. The bank will go and buy that house and take ownership of it. So they bought it for $150,000, and now they own that house. Now they will sell you that house on a markup, and the markup can be whatever. It can be 100,000, 150,000. So they'll sell the house. Just one second. They'll sell the house back to you to $300,000. Now that's how they make their money, because they own an asset which they then have sold to you. And the example that I always give is that when you go to a 7-Eleven and you buy a pack of gum, the pack of gum is sold for $2. 7-Eleven did not buy that pack of gum at $2. They bought that pack of gum at 30 cents, right? But they marked up the gum and sold it to you. And when you own an asset, you are permitted to mark it up whatever you want, because it's yours. I can sell you this portfolio for $500 because I feel like it. It's my, I can do it. This is not interest. This is an asset that I'm selling, so a markup from my ownership, I'm selling it to you and giving it to you. Ownership of a physical asset is where risk comes into place. And the difference of a conventional and Islamic banking example of this is that for a conventional bank, when you want to buy a house, they will say, we're going to give you a $300,000 loan, and then you take that money and buy a house. And they're going to charge you a markup on the money, which is interest. Where an Islamic bank will buy the house and they own that asset. The conventional bank is just giving you money to buy an asset. They're not taking ownership of the house. An Islamic bank will buy the house, take ownership of it, meaning that they've taken the risk of that asset, and then they sell it to you at a markup, which is from a Sharia, which is permitted. An Islamic legal maxim is called no risk, no reward. There has to be risk in order for you to actually get reward. And interest is a riskless state, that regardless of how things turn out, you have to pay a fixed amount.
So how do you account for in a loan or in when lending out money? How do you account for inflation or devaluation of the currency of the set amount over a certain period of time? Are you allowed to charge a markup on that, or is that still considered?
No, well, when an Islamic bank is going to be selling you that house, of course they're going to be keeping into consideration that whatever their markup is, they're going to obviously take into consideration factors of future fluctuation, etc., etc. But once the price is set, at that point they cannot fudge around with it. Now it's set. And that is another important, that now you know, regardless of how the economy is, what you owe, and it will never fluctuate up and down. That it's fixed. And again, it's a level of fairness, right? It's not a game that you're playing with things here and there every 5 years, etc., etc.
My
find there's a huge difference between the example you gave of the pack of gum at the 7-Eleven and the Islamic financing way of buying a house. If you go to 7-Eleven, they didn't buy the gum only after you entered into a contract with them that they will resell it to you. They bought it and it's there for anyone to buy, whereas in the example you gave, I find that it's interesting because it kind of shows the limits of Islamic financing, at least the way you're describing it, in the sense that they're only buying the house if you enter into a contract with them, saying that they will sell it to you at this particular price. Only then they will go and buy it, and that's something that's precisely prohibited by Sharia.
When they actually buy the house, they're not putting you into, they have actually taken risk of that asset. So there is different contracts that are in place when an Islamic financial institution actually purchases the home. And again, this example is only one product that is used. There's many other financial examples Islamic financial products that are used. This is one. This is a debt example. You have a musharaka example. There's leasing example. There's leasing partnership ownership example. So there's many different items. When you go into a 7-Eleven, of course, but the example was showing in reference of having an asset and why it is permitted to charge a markup, because there is a risk of ownership. And that is why in the Sharia perspective it is permitted to mark something up, because you have now assumed the risk of that asset that you have actually owned. In that time frame when the bank owns that asset that has taken the house, if the market fails, they're on the hook for it. Simple as that. They are actually on the hook for it. There is risk. A conventional bank ain't on a hook like that at all. Right? So there is that difference in reference of how it functions.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. Just want to give it another round of applause for phenomenal topic, and it's a privilege having you.